Hi, how are you? When you're talking about women's oppression, there are so many things you could talk about. I was kind of wondering what I would be talking about today. Would be reproductive rights or violence or, super oppression faced by Black, Latina, and Native women, all of these things. But, last month actually marked the 50-year anniversary. February is the 50-year anniversary of the landmark feminist work, The Feminine Mystique by Betty Friedan. And for those of us who are younger who might not know, when this book was published in 1963, it was a very big deal. This work challenged the widely held patriarchal idea that the natural role of women is to be wife and mother, and that this is the most fulfilling and worthwhile thing a woman could do with her life. The book made the case for involving women in meaningful work as a means to self-actualization, and thus, it sparked a revolution in consciousness. It really spoke to women, predominantly middle-class white women, but still significant sectors of the population who are on the verge of rebelling against the rigid social constrictions placed on them and the complete political, social, and economic marginalization that characterized their lives. This book came out around the same time as The Second Sex, and it's largely credited with helping to launch the second-wave feminist movement. It certainly inspired millions of women to fight for their right to be in the workplace and to have a family, to, as they say, have it all. A few weeks ago, the New York Times published an interesting piece evaluating the impact of this work. It was called, quote, "Why Gender Equality Stalled." This article points to an alarming trend of the last 2 decades, which has seen a rollback in the gains won by the women's movement of the 60s and 70s, particularly with regard to women in the workplace. The article states that, quote, "Between 1994 and 2004, the percentage of Americans preferring the male breadwinner, female homemaker family model actually rose to 40% from 34%, so it rose in between 94 and 2004. Between 1997 and 2007, the number of full-time working mothers who said they prefer to work part-time increased to 60% from 48%. In 1997, a quarter of stay-at-home mothers said full-time work would be ideal. By 2007, only 16% of stay-at-home mothers wanted to work full-time. Women's labor force participation in the United States also leveled off in the second half of the 1990s, in contrast to its increase in most other countries. Gender desegregation of college majors and occupations slowed, and although single mothers continued to increase their hours of paid labor, there was a significant jump in the percentage of married women, especially married women with infants, who left the labor force. By 2004, a smaller percentage of married women with children under 3 were in the labor force than in 1993. So what does that mean? What happened in the last 2 decades? What are the obstacles that we've come up against, and what's caused a shift in consciousness, with more women opting out of the workforce today, when our foremothers fought so hard for our right to be there? We've all seen the right-wing interpretation of this phenomenon. A lot of right-wingers, a lot of talking heads and columnists, they argue that this means that women never really wanted equality. They said, we wanted it and we got it and we decided we didn't want it anymore, so we went home, It's a popular mythology that relies on old stereotypes, exactly those which Friedan and others challenge, the idea that women are inherently happier in a domestic role. While looking around to write this presentation, I typed in feminism makes in Google, and the phrase feminism makes women unhappy was the top Google result. So clearly this idea has some traction, Even some who identify as progressive or feminists themselves cave to this idea. They look at the data and conclude that what the women's movement of the 60s and 70s were actually fighting for was choice. So if women now choose to stay home, that's a form of progress. That's a choice you should respect. This puts aside the larger goal of the feminist movement, which is equality, entirely. It's an individualist and, in a way, a defeatist theory. It puts aside our goals for all women and is able to declare victory when some women of means are able to do what they say they want to do, Stephanie Kuntz, the author of this New York Times article, takes the materialist approach to this question. The New York Times piece points out things we already know, that women are paid less than men across the board. At every level of education and every occupation, women are paid less for men for the same work that less than men for the same work that men do. Women are also statistically less likely to have jobs that offer flexible hours or family-friendly benefits. Women who have children face routine and well-documented job discrimination, often being denied promotions or let go because they can't keep up. Anecdotally, I saw a local news segment recently about how to get a job in this tough economy, and concealing that you have a family was like their #1 tip. They went so that was a lot of it was really sick. They were like, don't put up any pictures of kids. They said that you should take the child's car seat out of your car before you drive to the interview. But really, who is most likely to have a child's car seat in their car? It's going to be the woman. The reality is that working conditions for all workers in the US are deteriorating, and it has a disproportionate impact on women who are overwhelmingly tasked with childcare. But across the board, those who are employed right now are working longer hours with less vacation and less pay, and this has a direct impact on the ability of women to participate in the labor force. Today, almost 40% of professional men work 50 or more hours a week. As of 2000, the average couple where both are working work a combined 82 hours a week, and that's the average, with something like 15% reportedly working more than 100 hours a week. The Institute for Women's Policy Research did a study comparing the United States, quote, work-family policies with other developed nations, and the US came in dead last. The United States is the only developed country that does not guarantee paid maternity leave for new mothers. Many countries offer paternity leave for fathers as well. The US, of course, does not. Many countries limit the number of hours an employer can require you to work. The US does not. And the US also does not prohibit employers from reducing the hourly pay or benefits for workers who scale back their hours, which is actually something that the European Union banned by law. So as a result, the rates of women in the workforce have been increasing in Europe and in many developed countries, while simultaneously decreasing in the US, where one is penalized for wanting to leave work and spend time with your family. Studies show that the majority of young couples prefer a family model, where domestic responsibilities and child-rearing responsibilities are shared equally between both partners. But when both partners are working long hours and childcare is unaffordable, in most states, childcare is estimated to cost as much or as more as the average rent. It makes sense that the partner who earns less money, who has less chance of advancement, will be the one who decides to stay home. Kuntz makes the argument in the NYT piece that under these hostile conditions, it makes sense the woman would leave the workplace. She also points to a series of interviews with women who initially said they preferred to leave their jobs and stay home, but when they were pressed further, for the most part, revealed that they had in fact exhausted all of their options at their job before making the decision to leave. Specifically, it says, quote, when they could not get the flexible hours or part-time work they wanted, when their husbands would not or could not cut back their hours, and when they began to feel that their employers were hostile to their concerns, women often opted out. Consciousness flows from our conditions, and when faced with a seemingly impossible situation, many people will decide that what they've been backed into doing is what they want to do. In this way, the US ruling class is particularly brutal when compared to the ruling class of other developing nations. We know this manifests itself in a number of fronts. Our pharmaceuticals cost more, our healthcare costs are higher. As mentioned, our working hours are longer as well than many workers in many capitalist countries. It's confusing because in the case of women and women's issues, our ruling class and our media and all that, it's all about political correctness, right? Like if, for example, Senator Aikens says something about legitimate rape, or, there's a legislator today who said something to, like a teenage girl testifying, something wildly inappropriate. Like, that kind of thing gets reported widely in the corporate media, If a politician says any of those classic sexist or chauvinistic things, it gets reported here more widely, perhaps, than any country in the world. Op-eds are written, commentators comment, other politicians condemn the offensive things said. So, in one way, in kind of a surface way, this appears to be a country that's very sensitive to women's oppression. But on the same token, the way that the US capitalist society has organized the economy and different areas of the economy, when you look at things like how many hours workers are forced to work, the absence of childcare, the absence of affordable health care, the fact that many women who have children are literally unable even to pay their bills, that we can't go to a doctor and put food on the table simultaneously. Like at the end of the day, if you look at all these areas that directly affect women's lives, like healthcare, poverty, long hours, violence, access to education, in spite of the appearance of sensitivity to women that is a point of pride in this country, so much so that we've all heard that, they're very proud of saying that America's a leader on women's rights. Isn't that why the U.S. invaded Afghanistan, right, to liberate the women in Afghanistan? Like in spite of this mantra, in reality, the way that our country, that our economy is organized is extremely brutal for women. For working class, low income, and even middle class women, despite all the rhetoric and the sophistication and the savvy of the ruling class, with regard to discussing these issues, at the end of the day, as the Kuntz article goes to the great lengths to point out, conditions for working women in this country are barbaric. From the point of the view of the PSL, we're struggling to expand democracy. That is part of our struggle. Not simply for the expansion of the right to vote, which is an important victory fought for and won by women, by African Americans, and currently, importantly, being attacked by the racist Supreme Court. We also mean fighting for the expansion of democratic rights for the most oppressed sectors of society. Rights for African Americans, rights for immigrants, and especially for women. And when we fight for the expansion of democratic rights for women, as we're doing on March 8th and 9th, when we'll be demonstrating against violence against women, or on August 26th, when we fought for reproductive rights, when we fight for the rights of women in the workplace, when we're in this fight, we know that there's this other element, that the reality of how the capitalist society is organized means that every struggle for the expansion of democracy gains importance mainly because it teaches the participants that they have to fight for something greater. That we're not just fighting for our rights, but to reorganize society as a whole. We're not just fighting for affordable health care, we want free health care. We don't just want access to child care, we want free child care. We don't, every worker, men and women, should be able to work fewer hours. We should be able to put the unemployed to work, to give everyone shorter shifts and give everyone more free time with more pay. In other words, we need to rationalize society to gain equality. We need to organize our production so that it meets human needs, rather than sacrificing human needs to production. So keep that in mind, sisters and brothers, when you join us on March 8th and 9th. We are fighting for the expansion of the rights of women, and we are fighting against the system of capitalism, and in that struggle, we are fighting for socialism. Thank you.